Good evening. My name is Amanda Soa, and I'm a student project manager at the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues at Dickinson College. When we held the Clark Forum event in person, we took a moment to acknowledge that the land on which we gathered on belonged to indigenous people prior to European settlement. Currently, I am inhabiting the ancestral land of the Lenni Lenape, the Susquehannock, the Conestoga, the Haudenosaunee, the Shawnee, the Erie, and later the Indian children of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. I encourage everyone watching this evening's program to take a moment after our presentation to acknowledge the tribes whose traditional land you currently inhabit. On behalf of the Clark Forum, the Department of Sociology, Spanish, and Portuguese, and the Security and Studies program, I welcome you to tonight's event, Lethal Flows, the U.S. Role in Arms Transfers and Arms Trafficking to Latin America and the Caribbean. This program was initiated by Clark Forum student project managers. The presence of guns in Latin America and the Caribbean is the result of the arms trade that exists between the two regions and the United States. The accessibility of guns in the US and the lenient arms trading policies have made it possible for organized groups from Latin America and the Caribbean to gain access to guns. Legally, governments from Latin America and the Caribbean buy guns from the US government, which in turn often end up in the hands of gangs because of corrupt government agencies. Illegally, American sellers buy guns in the US to sell to gang affiliates from Latin America and the Caribbean. The presence of guns leads to an increased rate of drug trafficking from these regions to the US, which in turn amplifies violence. People then begin to flee to the US because their safety is being threatened. So as the US is sending out arms, it is also receiving a mass of displaced people and enhancing a lucrative drug trade. As an immigrant, I understand the anxiety and the fear that comes from leaving your homeland in search of better economic and social opportunities. I was lucky to have the choice to leave my homeland, but many migrants do not have that choice. As refugees, they are forced to leave their homelands to embark on a dangerous journey for which they cannot anticipate the dangers ahead. Gang violence and drug trafficking are some of the reasons they're leaving to protect themselves, their families, and their children. So as I reflect on the arms sales, I think of the immense spillover effect of emotional and physical trauma that I have only experienced a sliver of. Tonight, Adam Isacson will walk us through how these effects come about and offer some examples of policies that can help lessen the pain and suffering of others. As the director of the Defense Oversight program at the Washington Office on Latin America, also known as WOLA, Isacson monitors U.S. cooperation with Latin America's security forces. He's the author of the book, Altered States, Security and Demilitarization in Central America, and co-author of Just the Facts, A Civilian's Guide to U.S. Defense and Security Assistance to Latin America and the Caribbean. Isacson has produced over 250 publications, articles, book chapters, and policy memos over the course of his career and has testified in front of Congress several times. There will be a question and answer session immediately following the program, so please type your questions into the live chat next to this YouTube video at any time. We now welcome Adam Isacson to begin his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda, for that introduction, and it's really an honor to be here with all of you this evening. The original plan, of course, was to spend an evening with you and a day with you in Carlisle back in March. And unfortunately, we have to do it this way, but I'm happy to be accompanying you and hope that you can all hear me and that everything's working fine. I should just say the Washington Office on Latin America is a non-governmental human rights group focused on Latin America. There's about 30 of us on staff in Washington. Our mission is to make sure that human rights is a integral part of all U.S. relations and policy toward Latin America. At WOLA, I focus mostly on defense and security, the U.S. relationship with police and military forces around the region, which, of course, there is, going back to the Cold War and before, there's a difficult history there. But this evening, we're going to talk about violence, gun trafficking, and the role that the United States has played and should be playing in that problem. And I don't know how many of you listening are Latin American, so I'll just start out with a few overview points about Latin America in general. In order to do that, I'm going to share my screen, but I may have to ask you to allow me to share my screen. That is not working at the moment. But the basic sort of Wikipedia version of this is that, Latin America, there it is. Hold on, let me just do that. Share and play. Okay. Latin America is about 8% of the world's population, 650 million people. Most people there speak Spanish, Portuguese, indigenous languages. Some speak French or Creole in Haiti. The population is mostly mestizo, a combination of European and indigenous. There's a significant indigenous and Afro-descendant population in many parts of the region. Its sort of per capita GDP puts it sort of in the middle of the world. I mean, there are countries that whose poverty approaches sub-Saharan Africa. There are countries whose wealth approaches Southern Europe. The economies are very dependent often on commodities, everything from gold and oil and coal to soybeans or other agricultural exports. And that has meant they've gone through a lot of boom and bust cycles when things get prosperous, but also when, particularly right now, when poverty increases and people's standards of living fall alarmingly. There was some real progress across the region under the last commodity boom, which was with the late 2000s and the first half of the 2010s. Poverty rates declined dramatically. Middle classes emerged in many parts of the region. That's receding now. And one thing that underlying all of this that you kind of always have to understand about Latin America is this is income inequality. Latin America is consistently one of the most unequal parts of the world. And that map shows Cuba. Cuba maybe because of years of socialism may have shared poverty, but Venezuela would be on that list of unequal countries too if the data was available. But you can see sub-Saharan Africa, the far southern Africa has higher rates of inequality, but nowhere else has this kind of consistency of that gap between the rich and the poor. And that comes from a history of, a legacy of Spanish rule, tiny elites that owned much of the land and much of the what industrial base there was, and then large masses with little wealth and little opportunity. And that tiny elite got accustomed to being above the law and not having, so what we call rule of law, having the law apply to them. Over the last 70 years, this is a region that saw very fast population growth. The cities are much bigger than they used to be. But I have to really hammer down this point that you don't understand Latin America if you don't understand or always take into account inequality and often a lot of the injustice that goes along with it. So the region had a period of dictatorships, military dictatorships, many of them supported by the United States, which in 1974 is one reason WOLA was founded in order to stop that. Those gave way in the 1980s and early 1990s to, what globally is called the third wave of democracies. There has been some recent deterioration in the quality of the region's democracies and authoritarian regimes of the right and left being elected into office and then staying there. And that is of concern. But more immediately right now, as we look at, the violence that into which arms end up flowing, is that the region has a lot of ungoverned areas, be they, rural areas, wilderness areas, vast urban slums, where it's very hard to actually find a representative of government often, where you can be many hours away from your nearest cluster of government, where you can find basic services like roads, land titles, farm to market roads, health posts, or any school that's more than perhaps a primary school. Even in some of the wealthier countries, many parts of the country are often left alone. Quite often this overlaps with border areas. And these are areas where armed groups thrive, where organized crime has a lot of freedom to operate, even as they fragment. And you can see that map there of southwestern Colombia there on the left. That just shows how they sort of fragment into patchworks of who controls what. Areas where illicit crops can thrive, where huge environmental damage happens, as we're seeing in the Amazon right now, one of those abandoned areas. Interestingly, border zones are often among the ungoverned spaces, as I mentioned. And so you've got, a lot of areas where there's a lot of migration that is completely unchecked. This is a region that in those areas particularly has some of the highest homicide rates in the world. This is sort of the top 20 or so countries on the left in 2016 by homicide rate. And everyone with a red arrow is a Latin American country. And the map on the right shows where homicides were most prevalent in 2009. A majority of these killings, not a strong majority, but a majority involve firearms. And I'll get to firearms, don't worry. Who is perpetrating this violence? It's generally not terrorists in the sense of sort of ISIS or the Taliban or Al Qaeda or, what do they call it? Violent extremist groups. There's not many groups that meet that definition in the United States, in Latin America. In fact, there are a few armed groups today in the region that have political goals, by which I mean sort of a desire to take power in the country and govern themselves and implement a program or an ideology with some sort of revolution. Very few such groups. Instead, you've got a lot of criminal groups. The first category being what I've got on the screen here right now, cartels like the Sinaloa or Jalisco organizations or many others in Mexico, the First Capital Command in Brazil, the Gulf Clan in Colombia, many others who are often almost like multinational corporations of illegal economies. Yes, they traffic a lot of drugs, but they also are in charge of extortion, kidnapping for ransom, human trafficking, illicit precious metals mining, many ways of making illicit money in areas where there's just no rule of law, where elites have not bothered to bring government into and basic services to vast segments of the population because of this inequality. Another category are lower key, but very important in moving particularly drugs north, sort of family clans or regional traffickers who are only present in a few places. Sometimes there's a group called Insight Crime who do great work monitoring organized crime around the region. They call sort of the latest generation of these guys the invisibles, because it's people with lower profiles who are moving a lot of the products and making a lot of money and investing a lot of it even in the United States very quietly, or in Europe. And they're very hard to pin down because they survive by corrupting government, the same governments that are supposed to be going after them. A more visible but less important for things like the drug trade grouping of violent groups is gangs. The MS-13, who President Trump loves to talk about all the time, Barrio 18, both from El Salvador, moved into Honduras and Guatemala, numerous groups in Colombia. Los Pacheli is a big one in Medellin right now, the Pranes in Venezuela, just innumerable sort of neighborhood level or single city organizations around the country. They tend to be sort of poorer than the cartels. They would like to do international drug trafficking, but they usually don't get to. The cartels and the family groups and others keep them out from that. They're in charge maybe of selling drugs in their neighborhoods. Because they're poorer, they're way more predatory on the population. They extort everybody. They threaten everybody. They're responsible for bringing homicide rates over 100 per 100,000 in some places, responsible for many more attacks on the population. Now, on the ground, a lot of these groups, whatever their affiliation, whatever country they're in, they kind of look the same. You'll have people, usually young men or boys, usually between the ages of 15 and 35, who are not at school, no opportunity to go to school. They're not able to find a job. In many poor neighborhoods of Latin America, that describes more than half of boys and men in that age group, and many girls and women as well. They are the ones, actually physically they're out on the street carrying out threats, collecting extortion money. This is Brazil, where they actually carry long weapons in some of the favelas. You don't see that as much in many other countries. But these are people who are just systematically excluded and almost disposable in these very unequal countries, disposable in the eyes of the elite. Now, all of these groups thrive on links of corruption, with the exception of the few remaining guerrilla groups, mainly in Colombia, who want to still take over the state. Really, that we're just talking about the ELN, National Liberation Army. Almost all others, if they find themselves fighting the government, it means they're losing. They would much rather have their control of their area and have everybody in the government either intimidated by them or in their pay. And really, without that kind of corruption, organized crime cannot really operate. It's the oxygen that it breathes. And that's sort of the difference between an organized criminal group and, say, a traditional terrorist or insurgent group. They're much harder to fight, actually, because they prefer to penetrate, to bribe, and to gain control over the very government agencies that are supposed to be fighting them or are supposed to be bringing them under control. And when you have weak justice systems, as a lot of these unequal countries do, it's very hard to punish corruption even within the government. So that's the scenario in which the kind of violence, some of the worst violence in the world, is happening. Where do the arms come from? The kind of weapons that we're talking about. We're talking mainly about small arms here, like these gentlemen from the Jalisco cartel are carrying in this video they released in July. They're not talking about missiles or helicopters or other high-tech items. We're talking about rifles and pistols for the most part, including often high-caliber automatic rifles. Much of the region has laws much stronger than the United States laws prohibiting the possession of these kinds of small arms. So again, you depend on weak rule of law and you depend on corruption in order to distribute those arms around the country and have the authorities allow it to happen. Now, some weapons, as Amanda mentioned, leak from official stockpiles of weapons from sort of the military or police's own arsenals because of corruption. Or because an armed group is actually powerful enough to raid and steal it. I don't think that's the principal vector at all, though, for getting weapons into the hands of criminal groups in Latin America. There are small amounts of domestic production that fall into the wrong hands, but most countries don't have their own small arms industries. Some weapons are actually homemade. There's crude rifles that you occasionally see. There's a lot of handmade landmines in Colombia in particular. Sometimes you'll hear of people using outfitting or adjusting drones. But most of the weapons we're talking about are weapons that are obtained on the black market, smuggled from other countries. And as we'll see in a moment, in much of the region, the United States gun market is the main source. But let's back up and talk about first about just the U.S. role in Latin America, because we haven't yet. Now, historically, a lot of authors, one I mentioned in a meeting with students today is Lars Schultz from the University of North Carolina. They've noted that the United States, going back through a century and more of diplomatic cables and other statements, they've tended to view Latin America as an inferior place with a bit of white supremacy in some of the language historically. Just a chronic basket case, a place with, sort of hot-tempered leaders who don't follow rules. And as a result, the region is a chronic source of threats and problems. You have your extractive industries and your commodity industries, but basically you're looking at threats coming from the region. And just in the last 30 years, you're excused if you don't have whiplash in Latin America, because the United States has sort of slapped a label of what is the principal threat coming from Latin America. And that label has changed pretty dramatically. You had, by the late 80s, early 90s, it was still the Cold War. And you're looking at, the Reagan administration was concerned about the spread of communism. After the Cold War ended, that quickly switched to, the Medellin and Cali cartels and other drug trafficking groups around the region. The war on drugs really heated up in the late 80s through the 90s. That changed again after September 11th, the war on terror, looking for terrorist groups around the region and really only finding some significant ones in Colombia, but certainly a lot of counterterror assistance went to the militaries and police forces of the region at the time to try to stop there was just a lot of money for counterterrorism after September 11th. And even though Latin America wasn't a principal theater in the war on terror, it became a pretext for a lot of assistance to militaries and police forces. Then that kind of faded away. By the Obama years, the big label was transnational criminal organizations, which included the narco trafficking, included the drug war, but recognized that a lot of these groups were sort of bigger and more embedded and more diversified. You might remember General John Kelly, who's been in the news lately when he was Donald Trump's chief of staff, et cetera. Before that, he was during the Obama years, he was commander of U.S. Southern Command, and he would often go before Congress and portray, quote, in his words, the network. The network is the threat. How all of the groups carrying out all of the illegal activities I've already talked about are somehow linked into one big network that threatened U.S. security interests, and that was the main reason why Southcom needed resources in order to keep the United States safe from transnational organized crime. That has kind of faded away under the current administration. The General Mattis, when he headed the Defense Department, didn't hardly include any mention of organized crime in the National Defense Strategy that they put together in 2018. Instead, and actually the Trump administration is really scattered. What a surprise, right? But it is. The Defense Department likes to talk now about external powers trying to horn their way into Latin America, particularly China, sometimes Russia, sometimes Iran, as the threat that they see the most. But if you ever were to ask like John Bolton and the folks at the National Security Council and some people at the State Department, they would say the biggest threat to regional stability is three governments, the Cubans, the Venezuelans, and the Nicaraguans, who are all authoritarian governments and are, in many cases are visiting great suffering on their people, but they are really not the only. I wish we heard more about the interim regime in Bolivia and the corrupt regime in Honduras, in Guatemala, but they don't talk about those as threats. And then, of course, that's overlaid with sort of President Trump's, one of his main priorities out of the White House is stopping immigration from Latin America, becoming sort of really the guiding mission here. That's the sort of the whiplash we've been through as far as why the United States continues to have a close military relationship with Latin America. It has not come with as much aid lately. Military aid, of course, was huge during the Cold War when I was a child, and Ronald Reagan was raining military aid on El Salvador and Guatemala and elsewhere in Central America in the name of anti-communism. I mean, military assistance to Latin America was well in excess of $1 million a day in 1980s dollars. It grew more during the war on drugs. It, as I noted, increased during the war on terror, as you can see here. A lot of even today, most aid to the region is to the region's militaries and police goes through drug war programs. This came with, human rights violations often over the years, especially during the Cold War, really grave human rights violations committed by U.S. aided units, distortions to civil-military relations with the soldiers being stronger than the civilians in many areas, often with because of the missions and the capabilities the United States was giving them. During the drug war, a lot of assistance was given to the Colombian military and police, even as they collaborated with paramilitary groups, and then later, even as the military extrajudicially executed thousands of civilians in order to boost their body counts in the 2000s. Everywhere, again, the aid encouraged militaries to take on internal roles, putting them side by side with civilians in a way that would really be unthinkable and hope remains unthinkable inside the United States. There were some big sort of brand name bumper sticker aid packages in the last 20 years, Plan Colombia in the 2000s, which managed to weaken the FARC guerrillas, but did not really weaken organized crime and only had temporary effects on drug trafficking or drug production in Colombia. And then the Merida Initiative in Mexico in the late 2000s into the 2010s, which helped the government of Felipe Calderon really ramp up a military effort against some of the cartels in Mexico. Now those sort of wound down under Obama, who put more emphasis on development assistance and on civilian institution building assistance. I can overstate that. There was still a lot of military aid, but not as much as before. Donald Trump, who really does go by the America First slogan, is not a fan of either military or economic aid and really hasn't revived or called for big increases in military assistance, grant military assistance to the region. So there's the decline of the Obama years more or less continues in 2017 through 2019 at least. We also sell a lot of weapons to Latin America, and this chart is everything. It's helicopters, it's missiles, it's Humvees and boats. You know, the small arms that we're really talking about are very hard to separate out of this chart because it's you know, it's such a small amount of money, and it's a lot of it is sales that are licensed from U.S. corporations to governments, which it's very hard then to get. The reporting is terrible on how much of those licenses actually end up in deliveries of weapons. But again, the arms sales, they went up for a while, mainly because of the commodities boom that Latin America was experiencing. That at the time, oil prices were very high. So were a lot of food prices. China's demand was very high, and countries like Brazil and others were buying up a lot. They were during this period that's portrayed here, actually in South America, United States actually, I should note, fell into third place among arms sellers to South America. Brazil and Venezuela in particular were preferring to buy from Russia, China, and France, more Russia and France than the others. But still, the United States was the #1 seller in Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. But of course, again, the small arms aren't really reflected here. The rifles, the pistols, and the ammunition. Now, most of what is depicted here is government to government sales, and governments do use some U.S. bought guns that they buy with their own money to commit human rights abuses. The Stop U.S. Arms to Mexico project cited a big sale from Colt Manufacturing in Connecticut, which exported machine guns to Honduras, that the military police there then went on to use to fire on protesters against electoral fraud after the president pretty much stole the 2017 election. The Colt shipped about $3.5 million of machine guns, as they call them, to Honduras in a couple of years before that happened. Just last month, not a U.S. policy issue, but the German company Heckler & Koch suspended all arms sales to Brazil because the Brazilian police were it was documented that they have been under Jair Bolsonaro, in particular in Rio, in Sao Paulo, shooting indiscriminately at people particularly in the favelas of Rio, and Sao Paulo. So a German gun dealer actually stopped selling to Brazil. That's how bad some of the human rights abuses have gotten. The United States has not stopped arms sales, or much less small arms sales to Brazil. In fact, it's encouraging more right now. Some small arms, as I said before, may make their way to the criminal gangs via corruption or leaky stockpiles. But again, most of it is trafficking. And a lot of it is the closer you get to the United States, the more likely it is that a country's weapons used by organized crime originated in the United States. So here's some trace data. I wish we had it more current. This is from the Government Accountability Office, which finds that in Mexico, at least 70% of weapons that are recovered at crime scenes in Mexico originated in the United States. So they might not have been manufactured in the United States, but they were purchased in the United States. They can trace it back to U.S. gun shops and gun shows and other gun dealers. As you can see, border states account for the majority of these sales: California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. The Center for American Progress in 2018 noted that between 2014 and 2016, across 15 countries, North America, Central America, and the Caribbean, 50,133 guns were recovered by authorities there at crime scenes. That means, according to their math, every 31 minutes in Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean during those years, U.S. source guns were used to commit crimes in these nearby countries. 70% of gun crimes in Mexico, as I said, involve American-bought weapons, and this overall has brought really increased the importance of U.S.-made arms to the commission of crimes in Mexico. The share of homicides in Mexico involving a firearm, only about 1 in 6 homicides in Mexico in 1997 involved a gun. Now, 2/3 of them do. That suggests that around half of Mexico's murder victims, who are about 40,000 people a year, were killed by a gun manufactured in the United States. In Central America and the Caribbean, again, the further you get from the United States, it's still a significant source of weapons, but not always as significant. But in Central America, it's usually about half of guns recovered at crime scenes can be traced back to the United States. In Brazil, it's not as bad as Mexico and Central America, but still Brazil's federal police reported at the end of 2017 that the U.S. continues to be the largest indirect source of illegal handguns and assault rifles. They seized more than 1,500 American-made guns in 2015 through 2017. That confusing chart on the right comes from, I'm sorry to, it's the best one I could find. This kind of comes with a report that was just released this month from the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. The inside donut shows that in South America, 89% of weapons flows are originated in Northern America, which would be the United States or probably Mexico. Interestingly, though, a lot of the guns actually are made in Southern Europe. Italy, Romania, no, I'm sorry, Bulgaria is a big manufacturer of weapons, which of course then get exported to the United States, bought in the United States, and then brought to the region. So how is it so easy? I think, as you can imagine, how it's so easy, but how is it so easy for the United States to be so central to the trafficking of weapons into Latin America, to its criminal groups? Our permissive gun laws are almost unique they're definitely unique in the hemisphere, almost in the world, how easy it is to get a big gun quickly in the United States. In a matter of hours or days, it's very simple, and there's lots of places to do that, to get that gun. They're right near the U.S. Mexico border. Gun shops are a big one. There are over 7,000 licensed firearms dealers in Texas alone. California has 3,100 more, Arizona 2,300, New Mexico 900. Many gun shops. I mean, there may be, some sort of waiting period or background check, but if you buy it at a gun show, and their gun shows are very frequent in border states, there is the loophole where you can actually take home the weapon that same day. Now, a study cited in The Economist recently found that found that homicides in Mexico increased dramatically after 2004. And that study notes that between 1994 and 2004, there was an assault weapons ban that the Clinton administration and then the Democratic Congress passed in 1994, making it harder to buy many categories of assault weapons. That ban expired in 2004. George Bush did not renew it, and gun-related homicides notably went up in Mexico after that. This is making us a hub for illicit narco trafficking or drug trafficking. Sorry, man. Making us a hub for illicit gun trafficking in the region is just an incredible irresponsibility. But it is a result of our own domestic laws. Now, this doesn't usually happen with like giant truckloads of weapons going all at once. There's not like a container or a weapon or a cargo ship full of small arms going into Mexico. It goes little by little. This UN Office on Drugs and Crime report, I'm borrowing this graphic from, again, this is the one that just came out this month. The graphics are, I find I have to stare at them for a long time, but ultimately what you get from this is that the shipments of weapons that are being seized crossing the border into Mexico tend to be shipments of less than 6 firearms almost all the time. And quite often just one firearm. Somebody just buys an AR-15 and throws it in the trunk of their car and drives south. So, the United States, that's what the United States is finding in its southbound checks, and that's what Mexican authorities are finding up near the Mexican border. Normally, the trafficking between other countries, as you can see, far more common to find loads of 6 firearms or more, including, cargo containers full of weapons. But yeah, about 78% of firearms are are 5 firearms or less when they seize them, which is pretty remarkable. So they call this straw purchasing or anti-trafficking, this model of somebody just going to a gun shop in Texas, buying a gun perfectly legally, freely and clearly, and then driving south into Mexico. And most of the time when you drive south into Mexico, you are waved through. And even if you aren't, if it's well bundled behind the wheel well of your trunk of your car, they may still not find it. And then you sell it to an organized crime contact for a big profit. There are still few southbound checks that U.S. authorities set up leaving the United States into Mexico. Doing so snarls traffic in border towns, and people don't like it. But Even so, you will be in trouble if you're caught in Mexico being an ant trafficker. In the United States, maybe not. Trafficking illegal guns into Mexico trafficking guns that are legal here and illegal in Mexico is not a crime in the United States. It sounds crazy, but it is not. If you were to be an ant trafficker and U.S. authorities catch you driving an assault rifle into Mexico, it's not a federal crime. Some of the more popular models that Mexican criminal groups are using that they're buying via this vector they're increasingly these long guns. I mean, there are a lot of pistols and revolvers, but semi-automatic and automatic rifles are very popular. They're about half of what is being seized and probably being used. One of the most popular models is the Barrett 50 caliber pistol, which fires a projectile probably about half as big as a Coke can. Mexico is seizing about 6 of these per month. You saw some of them in that video of the Jalisco cartel a few slides ago. But, my whole point here is, just know that the United States, again, this is one of these UNODC graphs. The dotted black arrows show that, it's a major vector. And then the red arrow there shows that it is a super major vector. The United States is a hub on a huge illegal criminal network. We are to guns in the region what Colombia is to cocaine or what Mexico is to fentanyl. And it's because it is so easy to buy them here. So, what's the way out of this? I've talked about everything from, inequality to ungoverned spaces to organized crime, corruption, and gun violence. I mean, one thing we know is that, the United States can't, just fix Latin America, right? We're not right now showing ourselves to be a model of governance either. We have been more prosperous historically, but we can't just say, here, Latin America, here's some aid, do this instead. I think we've tried that a lot since the 20th century, and it really has not worked. What we can do is to get out of the way of and offer support to a lot of the democratic pro rule of law reformers in the region. That's, a big one there is there are many people who believe in their countries, who believe in the idea of the rule of law, who believe in reducing inequality through legal means, who believe in spreading freedom. They often threaten the interests of the elites in those countries. Those elites are often very pro-U.S., very open to U.S. investment, and often have their own cultural ties to the United States. So the U.S. government often identifies with those elites, even if they are more corrupt than the reformers that I'm talking about. The reformers are often more middle class, or they're organizers among the poor. A big category are people who are actively working in their countries to try to break ties between organized crime and government. Like that first picture there on the left of the UN sponsored Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, which was actually closed down by the Guatemalan government about a year ago with no pressure from the Trump administration. Another big category are people trying to undo illegal activity that maintains inequality in the region, trying to make it sure that nobody is above the law, whether they're generals or large landowners or powerful politicians. Another category are honest judges and prosecutors, often trying to work within institutions that are riven with corruption themselves. So much in Latin America goes through the justice system, whether you're trying to punish corruption or punish the killers of social leaders, or even trying to guarantee the safety of investments. You need a strong justice system. And people who are trying to do the right thing in those systems need help, need assistance, need security, also need resources. Journalists, especially investigative journalists, legislators who really want to do their job right and are dedicated to oversight. There are honest military officers, many of them whistleblowers often within their institutions. And of course, social leaders and human rights defenders in civil society who are, trying to defend land rights. They're trying to reform justice. They're trying to they're trying to pursue alternatives to illicit crop cultivation. They're trying to stop damaging environmental projects. As the chart there in the lower right from the organization Frontline Defenders shows, in 2019, 304 people identified as human rights defenders were killed around the world. Of those 304, 208 of them were killed in Latin America, very often with firearms. Look at what is happening to them, right now in Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, Honduras. Colombia alone is already well over 100 social leaders killed so far in 2020. Supporting endangered performers has to be really a cornerstone of our foreign policy in Latin America right now. Now, interestingly, so much of this runs through U.S. domestic policy. WOLA started out as a foreign policy organization, but we find ourselves in the middle of a lot of domestic policy debates as we try to find solutions to the U.S. role in arms trafficking as well as in the violence in Latin America. We really delude ourselves these days if we portray this as sort of a foreign policy issue only, that we can just go leave it up to the diplomats and the soldiers to handle. Intermestic is sort of an icky term, but we sort of need to use it for lack of another better term. And there's three areas of domestic policy I just want to talk about really fast. One is migration policy. You got this circular path here. There was U.S. military aid during the Reagan years to Central America during the civil wars there that helped worsen those civil wars. That caused a refugee flow, particularly from El Salvador, but also other countries, into the United States. 1 in 5 Salvadorans left El Salvador during the 1980s. Many ended up in cities like Los Angeles, where the young people in those refugee communities ended up being, having to defend themselves against other people in those poor communities. Like in El Salvador, in Los Angeles, East LA, Salvadoran kids formed gangs to defend themselves against Mexican gangs. And one of those was called Mara Salvatrucha, MS. Another was called 18th Street because of the 18th Street in Los Angeles. Those gangs got more and more into trouble, and many gang members and leaders got deported, particularly during the Clinton years, and the Bush years, back into Central America. In Central America, they formed gangs, which grew even more quickly in all of these ungoverned, abandoned spaces. Those gangs grew and got more predatory, preying on citizens, and also corrupting and hollowing out and rendering the police and the government unable to protect them. That made those cities, from San Salvador to San Pedro Sula, completely unlivable. And what we've seen since about 2013 is waves and waves of families and children fleeing Central American countries, coming back to the United States, whether in caravans or on their own, asking for asylum. This horrible circular mixing of U.S. immigration policy and U.S. foreign policy to Central America. And there's really no other word but horrible. How do we deal with this? We have to be more efficient and open to how we process asylum seekers and refugees. And how we give them a quicker, fairer hearing in our immigration court system, because they're going to keep coming for quite a while until the root causes of this fleeing ends. We have to work with and strengthen reformers in those countries, the people I was just talking about, in order to address those root causes that are pushing people out. We have to work with the receiving countries themselves when we do deport gang members, and make sure they can absorb this flood of deportees with violent criminal records, so they can rehabilitate them and reintegrate them into their societies properly. Drug policy, another big area of domestic policy that has a huge impact on violence and how arms are used in Latin America. Obviously, the prohibitionary approach. I should just say the graphic here I love, because it's put up by actually the Republican-run Homeland Security Committee in the Senate using official data, and it just shows the steady drop over 20 years, a little more than 20 years, in the price of every drug on the streets of the United States. Why did it drop? Because supply was meeting demand as well as ever, which means that we were not stopping supplies. The prohibitionary model drives up prices and makes it more profitable for organized crime to traffic drugs. I think we need to debate that model. How can we balance harms and benefits better? How can we get some flexibility in the very rigid international 1961 drug conventions and the 1980s and 90s criminalization laws, and how we can treat our addict population, who account for about 80% of demand, as sick people who need help and not people who need to be locked up and pursued, which costs money. How do we take on banks and real estate to see that they are carrying out far more due diligence about money laundering, because the money that groups make, a lot of it does end up here in the United States with insufficient scrutiny, as well as the money from corruption that drug trafficking organizations channel to corrupt state officials. So in order to, so I've already proposed with immigration, we take on, the hardline immigration people. With drug policy, we somehow convince the government to spend a heck of a lot more money on drug treatment and take on the banks and the real estate industry. So far we're, this is a pretty asymmetric fight. Throw in gun control when you're taking on the NRA and the Second Amendment lobby, but clearly a renewed assault weapons ban would do wonders for closing one of the main vectors for getting these dangerous weapons into Latin America. But okay, taking on the banks, taking on the gun lobby, taking on these very powerful interests, this isn't easy. No liberal, even if say Joe Biden wins by a landslide, I mean, no sort of moderate liberal U.S. administration is going to take on these interests to change these policies in a dramatic way on their own. They're going to need to be pressured constantly by civil society. There's going to have to be a movement. Now, a group like WOLA can't build a movement on its own. We're small. And as you can see, we're pretty wonky. We like our charts and graphs and maps and things like that. But we can certainly inform that movement. We can explain it. We can explain the issues better in order to prod the U.S. officials whom we talk to all the time into doing what's right. And that's where I see at least a glimmer of hope for getting out of this conundrum that we've been stuck with now, really for generations. And well, thank you for listening to me for what it seems to have been 45 minutes. And I look forward to your questions. I'm going to unshare my screen and show my face again. There we go.
Isacson, thank you so much for that very insightful and informational talk. I think a lot of our viewers learned a lot. And my question to you is, and you may have talked about it in your presentation, but why do you think that it's going to take a lot of pressure and a lot of hands-on efforts for our U.S. policies and for our government and officials to kind of recognize that there is certain actions we need to take to kind of reduce all that's going on between us in terms of like arms trading and arms trafficking and drug trafficking and migrants, because they all kind of are related. And I mean, it seems as if having a concrete long-term structure would benefit both us and Latin America. So
yeah. And often a lot of the things I just recommended are things that Latin American presidents will recommend when they meet with U.S. diplomats. And U.S. diplomats say, yeah, these are domestic U.S. issues. Now, I guess there's two reasons why it's hard. One is power, and the other is probably just sort of polarization and culture. The power I alluded to. I mean, taking on the banks so that they really spend big resources to root out money laundering is a big ask. Asking, look how far that the Parkland or the Columbine or those students have, they've done an amazing job of organizing, but they haven't had a legislative victory yet. It takes a lot of energy because it is asymmetric. The gun lobby is extremely strong. And it's extremely strong because of the second reason, polarization and culture. There are many people in the United States, not a majority, a strong minority, who are almost single issue voters, that they will vote on the basis of gun control. It may be mythology in the Democratic Party, but a lot of people in the Democratic Party believe that the 1994 assault weapons ban cost them the majority in Congress in the 1994 midterm elections. This is a very motivated, it's a very motivated part of the Republican base and the base of some Democratic members of Congress as well. So yeah, I mean, there will need to be a lot of energy in order to tip the balance, because otherwise a liberal or moderate liberal member of Congress or president or somebody like that who may see things your way just isn't going to want to poke that hornet's nest. They want to stay in their job. You'll have to help them poke it.
Thank you. And my next question is, as we move forward into the future and with everything that's going on, what do you think activists in the United States, not in Latin America, but activists here, right, in the United States, what can they do on their part, and what should be their main focus to create change?
Let's see, that it's a few things, unfortunately, which sort of divides us. But as I said, there's all of these things going on at once. I mean, if you kind of have to follow your heart. One thing I would like almost all activists to do, at least in some of their time, is to push more on keeping social leaders and other reformers alive in Latin America. When a group like WOLA or Amnesty or Human Rights Watch, the Latin America Working Group, when we put out an alert about somebody being threatened on social media, we say, please call your congressperson, whether it's an activist or a reporter or even an honest government official, and saying, please follow those instructions and do help keep those people alive. It's amazing what even 100 calls to a member of Congress or to the State Department or whoever, getting them to then convey a message to that country's embassy. In most countries, that actually results in action that keeps that person from being alive and being killed, and also makes clear that that person is somebody who has friends and a network outside of the country, and makes them less. It makes them more untouchable, although they're still quite touchable. Other than that, I mean, we need changes to immigration dramatically. Right now, the right to get asylum at the U.S. border has been pretty much shredded by regulation, not even by passage of any laws during the last 3 years. There's a lot to do there, and there are a lot of pro bono lawyers and other service advisors who are stretched as thin as they possibly can be. I mean, activists need help there, and there's going to be a long list of immediate reforms that need to happen if there's a change in power in November. On drug policy, take your pick, whether your flavor is decriminalization or harm reduction or increasing access to treatment or just all-out legalization. There are a lot of groups that could use your help and participation in order to move this debate. There are still way too many people in the United States who just think that the drug addict population, which is responsible for so much of the money right now going into this, are sort of a disposable population. And there's even an unwillingness, even in some of the places hardest hit by opioids, to spend more even on things like naloxone. That's a series of attitudes that has to be changed through education and through a lot of dialogue. And finally, on gun control, that's been a lonely fight of a lot of groups. A lot of the school shootings and other episodes in the United States have helped raise awareness about it, but the energy has to keep going. I would say now that the NRA is in its own corruption and financial crisis, now would be a good time to push harder in the next administration. Again, in almost all of these issues, a lot of it is making space for legislators who are from, say, sort of purple districts, who don't want to lose their job, who have to get pulled in sort of a conservative. Their default mode is to go in a conservative direction so as not to make waves and give Fox News or their Republican opponent anything to talk about. So it's really sort of moving the window in a way that they feel safer joining your cause, which would make such a big difference in Latin America. And that's just a lot of education and a lot of pressure and dialogue.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Our next question is from, I am so sorry, I don't think I can see your name, but in terms of human rights, what makes countries like Latin America, what makes you feel optimistic? So I think they're asking what countries in Latin America feel optimistic about the future.
I think that, going back to look at Latin America in the 1980s or the 1970s, it was a region of military regimes disappearing and torturing thousands of people with complete impunity. Now you don't see that almost anywhere. There are a few countries that it's happening, and we're concerned about the direction many of them are going, but there is way more political space now to be in the political opposition, to be an activist, to push for human rights, to actually criticize the powerful. Some countries, Colombia, Mexico come to mind. You've got, a middle class that's somewhat educated, that has been electing some very interesting people at the local level. A friend of our community from the NGO world in Colombia, Claudia Lopez, was elected last September to be the first LGBT mayor of Bogota, a city of 8 million people. She's having a rough year between a lot of unrest and the COVID, but her numbers are still quite high because it just would have been unthinkable to have somebody from the center left who's LGBT be elected mayor of Bogota, even really 10 or 15 years ago. So you're seeing that opening of space, but keeping it open is a constant struggle.
Yeah. Our next question is asking, how have the organizations like the NRA responded to some of the facts you shared? So I'm guessing to the
Oh man.
to the statistics about how arms trafficking is kind of very prevalent and how it's pervasive in our society and in Latin America as well.
The NRA has made it very hard by lobbying hard. They've made it actually hard to get a lot of the ATF trace data. The groups that try to get this information have often been blocked because the ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms is not allowed to share everything that they have records of. So it's been hard even to get basic transparency over a lot of the tracing of the weapons found at crime sites and their origins. They're also not into things like having a lot of identifiable markings and other things on the weapons so that they could be traced back more easily, because I guess the argument is that this is government, big government limiting the Second Amendment and your ability to bear arms as you wish. Of course, the rhetoric at the level of rhetoric, at least, I believe the NRA does not oppose. Or wouldn't be opposed to more southbound border controls and things like that in order to stop some of the trafficking. They have one reason it is still not illegal to do southbound trafficking is because of the power of the gun lobby, however. And the general argument that they would use in a situation like Mexico is the same one they use after school shooting here. If everybody in Mexico had weapons and they could shoot back at the cartels, then the theory that they advance is that it would be more peaceful because there'd be more of a deterrent to cartels using that kind of violence or gangs using that kind of violence. Why don't people in the slums in San Salvador just all arm themselves against the gangs? Which sounds preposterous, but and maybe I'm putting words in their mouth, but I think that's the argument that they use.
Yeah. Our next question is, what are your thoughts on this is very specific, but what are your thoughts on the U.S. intervention and U.S. government intervention, which is in reference to Nixon and CIA in Chile during the Allende administration? Do you believe these actions directly lead to the rise of the Pinochet dictatorship?
Yeah, I think it's been pretty well documented that the Nixon administration actively supported the September 11th, 1973 coup in Chile that brought the Pinochet regime to power and knocked the elected Allende government out of power. To such an extent, I'll just quickly tell the story. In 1972-73, there were a group of Christian lay workers who were working in Chile, and they witnessed the coup and saw horrible things done to some of their friends. They had to leave the country. When they came to Washington and met with Nixon administration officials and talked to people in the U.S. Embassy in Chile before they left, they were brushed off. And it was pretty clear the Nixon administration was celebrating what had happened. And Henry Kissinger certainly was happy with the outcome. And they decided that there had to be an office in Washington whose job it would be to make sure that wouldn't happen again and that human rights be at the center of U.S. policy toward Latin America. And they called it the Washington Office on Latin America and, sort of started it in a broom closet somewhere in a church building in Washington. And it's grown ever since. And that's where I work. We're not a church organization anymore. We do more than just human rights. But the Chile coup is central to the origin story of WOLA.
Yeah. Thank you. It's like having lemonade out of lemons. So
I guess so.
It's a very sad story. And
I just want the lemons to stop coming. Yeah.
Definitely. Next question is, what do you make of intelligence agencies' role in the trafficking of drugs, weapons, and people? Historically, it has happened. It's likely it hasn't stopped. So what do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest examples are during the Cold War, where the CIA was, accused, and we're still, we've learned a lot from investigative reporting. I think we still have a lot to learn, particularly in the 1980s, of playing a role in trafficking weapons to pretty murderous people in Central America, and perhaps also assisting or at least turning a completely blind eye to cocaine trafficking out of Central America into the United States, into U.S. neighborhoods, in order to help pay for some of the operations of right-wing guerrillas in Nicaragua, the Contras, for instance. Intelligence agencies definitely played a role. I don't think they ever rose to the level where they were responsible for like the majority of human trafficking or drug trafficking or anything like that. But they made some pretty grave mistakes, particularly during the Cold War period. And I think we still have a lot to find out about the extent of that.
Yeah.
And nowadays, I have no idea. Hopefully, they are not. But it'd be interesting to know whether, I mean, what always worries you is if there's an organized crime group that is close to a U.S. tied elite in a region, or an organized crime group that maybe is fighting a guerrilla group that we don't like. And what do we know about what they're doing that we're just ignoring? What are we turning a blind eye to? An example would have been, paramilitary groups 20 years ago in Colombia.
Our next question is, how would your organization WOLA ethically consider domestic policy in general? So, for example, would you have large amounts of asylum seekers versus the poorest unskilled American groups trying to get the same rung of the societal ladder?
Interesting. So, I mean, if we, support an increase in the number of refugee admissions, for instance, and this is not my expertise because we're a foreign policy organization, but my impression is that if you were to admit, the Obama era level of refugees into the country, which is about 150,000 a year, excuse me, in a workforce of about, more than 100 million people, that would make a huge difference. And a lot of the jobs that those people would end up doing, if they are actually unskilled people with, elementary school educations, they would be limited to the kind of jobs that U.S. citizens simply don't take right now, whether that's domestic work or agricultural work. But if they were given a legal work status, they could at least be paying taxes and being given a legal wage with some, benefit guarantees of worker safety, and not have to stand in the Home Depot parking lot waiting for a handyman gig, which would be an improvement for everyone. And I just don't think that would be much of a competition for U.S. workers.
And I think this is going to be our last question, but someone in the audience asked, what are some things that students can do to contribute to the movement? I mean, your talk suggested methods to resolve this problem, but they're not institutional. So what is some things a student can do, more of hands-on, more easily accessible things that they can do?
Sure. I mean, the first one with keeping human rights groups, colleagues and counterparts alive in Latin America, a lot of that is just being on the mailing lists of a small number of US-based groups, or pick the country that you want to focus on. And if you know enough Spanish, also looking at the list of those NGOs, and then just responding to calls for help when they arise. Say on drug policy, I know Students for Sensible Drug Policy is a very active group with a lot of chapters on campuses around the country. They would be probably the first place I would look there. On immigration, I'm not sure who takes the most. I should know this. What is the most active group on immigration policy that involves students? I mean, I think the Dreamers, United We Dream, and others have probably taken the lead on this. And even though they're mostly working on DACA, they are also working on other issues. One thing to fight for instance, right now would be temporary protected status and maintaining that for Central Americans and expanding it to include Venezuelans. But I mean, there's plenty of room. At the student level, I think the Dreamers are probably in the lead on a lot of that. On firearms, I'm less familiar with what the grassroots network is. I know the Brady campaign has always been a big name, and there's probably a whole host of new organizations that sprouted up after Parkland that I'm just not, as a foreign policy guy, as familiar with. But there are, on those three issues in particular, there's plenty of people organizing on campus. I mean, but if there's so much room for activism right now. I mean, just even if you're working to keep people from being evicted in the middle of COVID, that would be a huge one. Or trying to, defund or if not defund, to deeply reform police would be, another one. There are so many issues and so many groups that are just really forming almost out of their own natural energy that you can find easily on social media and online, and then get involved with. Go to the virtual meetings, take on tasks, prove yourself to be reliable, come up with ideas, because we're all scrambling for ideas all the time, and just be part of that movement. There's not going to be one sort of national movement of everything, I don't think, unless on an issue like Green New Deal, maybe there eventually could be, but right now it still is sort of bifurcated among things that people see as the priority that they think they can contribute to the most. And it's really up to you to choose what that is, but do something. Voter registration is another big one right now, I should say.
Thank you so much for taking your time. That is all the questions for you today. And again, thank you. I mean, if this was non-COVID time, we would be on campus and we would have.
It'd be so nice, yeah.
Yeah, we would have a bunch of students come up to you and they would ask you questions and engage with you. But we take what we can get. So thank you once again.
Well, feel free to share my email, or you can go to just adamisacson.com and click on how to contact me. And if you do have a question or anything I can help with, feel free to do it that way. I might not respond for a few days, but I will be able to respond.
Yeah, and your email is on the WOLA website, right?
Yeah, it's just my first initial last name, Isacson@wola.org.
Okay, so for our audience, WOLA is again the Washington office on Latin America. So just again, just stay out there. Anyway, thank you so much. Yeah, and have a great night.
You too, Amanda. Thanks for doing such a great job with this event.
You're welcome.
And thanks to the Clark Forum. Bye-bye now.